Hello and welcome to Timbro. My name is Billy McCormick. I'm head of publishing and communications. Today we have with us Johnny Munkhammar, who has just written this book, The Guide to Reform: How Policymakers Can Pursue Real Change, Achieve Great Results, and Win Re-election. Johnny, why did you write this book?
Well, because I think it's a very important issue that many politicians know what they should do, but they don't do it because they feel there are many political obstacles that will lead to that they will not be re-elected. So they avoid pursuing the change they know would be very important. And I want to make politicians feel that they can go from knowledge to action and actually do the reforms and, as you said, achieve great results and get re-elected.
Is it just politicians who should read this book, or who actually should be reading your book?
Well, politicians is my one main group, definitely, but all their advisors and policymakers in general. And also, of course, everyone who wants to affect the policy debate could read this book and know for sure that it is possible to reform. And also, I think economists and businessmen who want to know how to convince politicians that they should do reforms, which arguments to use.
And perhaps journalists as well. How would you define reform?
I would define reforms in this book as I do as a measure that politicians do to facilitate change, progress, and wealth creation. This is a very wide definition, and it's very deliberate because I think that most people support change and progress and wealth creation, and I think it should be in everyone's interest to pursue reform and to support politicians that actually do reforms.
Which countries would you say today are in most dire need of reform?
Well, if we look at the 30 OECD countries, which are the countries that I focus in this book, I think that all countries are in need of reform, but to a varying degree. Some countries have done quite a lot and some countries have done quite little, but all countries have done something. But many countries, if we look at the main countries of Western Europe, like France, Italy, and Germany, they are really in a great need of reform, and I think they could need some advice about how to do it.
What kinds of specific reforms do you propose in the book?
I look at the very well established reform areas that we can see throughout society where we need reforms that might facilitate change and progress and wealth creation. And it's not my proposals. I basically look at the well-established proposals from the general policy debate and research from organizations such as the OECD or IMF or academic scholars, and it's fairly unanimous that we do need reforms to enhance growth, to enhance more jobs, employment, and to have more entrepreneurship, and to improve healthcare and social security. We need a number of reforms in a number of areas, also because society is changing in a globalized world.
Do you think that reform is politically expedient for politicians and policymakers, or are you basically theorizing from a safe distance?
Well, this is really not theory. Of course, I have theory as well in the book, but it's more like empirics, because I look at a number of countries, 12, 13, 14, depending on how you count, that did a lot in the real world, in reality. They did so many reforms in different areas with such astonishingly great results. And this has happened, which shows that reforms are definitely possible. And I want to take that experience and that conclusion to a number of countries that need reform today and say, they did it. It is possible to do it. So just do it.
What was the most striking example of reform that you came across during your research?
It's hard to grade, actually, which country has reformed the most, but I would say that many countries have done reforms in a number of areas, but also a few countries have specialized and went very far in a certain number of areas. And if you look at Australia, and they've done fantastic things to boost entrepreneurship. If you look at Iceland, they did a lot in privatizing the banks, and now we have Icelandic banks all over Europe. Look at Estonia and Slovakia, introducing low and flat taxes, having an enormous boost in growth. Look at Britain, how they privatized state-owned companies very successfully. Look at Sweden, how we introduced school vouchers and got school choice and competition between schools, improving school results, etc., etc. And if you combine this experience, and if you could do all of this, or at least some of this, in the same country, what a fantastic development you would have.
You've mentioned Iceland and so forth. That's quite a small country. Sweden, a small country. Is it possible for big countries to reform, say France?
Yes, and I also mentioned Britain with the privatizations, but as you say, that's a common myth, and I want to bust a couple of myths in this book, that it's easier for smaller countries to reform. And it's not true, because we can see Britain, we can see Spain has done a number of reforms, not least getting millions of immigrants integrated into the labor market through deregulations. And we can see the, which I have in my book, the From Welfare to Work reforms by Bill Clinton in the US. Of course, the US is a huge country, and they have reformed very successfully, reducing child poverty, increasing employment among young single mothers. So big countries can definitely reform.
Politicians, they're only in office for very limited periods. Is it possible for them to really push through reform and not commit some kind of political suicide?
Well, in the end of the book, among the conclusions, I have a number of bullet points about how to do it. Actually, this is, how you should reform, where you should start, in what sequence you should do it, etc. And these conclusions are based on these country examples. And I think that one main conclusion is that it is not politically hazardous to reform. All reformed governments, except one actually in Sweden, in these countries have been re-elected at least once. So that's also a myth that I want to bust. And I think if you follow these points that I have concluded with about how to do it, what strategy you could have as a reformer, I think definitely the prospects of getting re-elected and getting a very positive mark in history, those prospects look very good.
I think one of the biggest questions, I mean, of course, many politicians want to reform, many policymakers are pushing for reforms, but the biggest obstacle, of course, is communicating these reforms to the voters, to the people, getting them to understand why they want to do this. What is perhaps the best way, or how should they go about doing this so that these reforms are much easier to introduce?
I think it was Roger Douglas from New Zealand who had this Rogernomics, where he deregulated, decreased taxes, and got down the public expenditure substantially, and reformed New Zealand to becoming a very growing economy. He said that, let the dog see the rabbit. That's one thing. And he just said that people will follow you if you have a direction, if you say where you're going, what's the purpose with these reforms, and people will follow. And, of course, you have to be determined. You have to have, stepwise, of course, but yet a clear aim of where you're going. And also, I think, another thing is very important to be consistent in terms of actions and communication. You cannot do one thing and say another. You cannot do change and communicate non-change, because you have to be consistent with the mission and the values, and then people will feel that this is somebody who knows what she or he is doing.
Finally, I'd like to ask, if you had your choice, which country would you reform and why?
That's a very difficult question. Again, I think that if you look at the 30 OECD countries, every country is always in need of reform because we have a changing world. And we always have to adapt to new conditions in order to be really competitive and create more jobs and create better living standards, because all of that is possible. But it's only possible if we do reform. But of course, if you look at the worst performing OECD countries, not least again, France, Italy, perhaps Germany, those are the countries that really need reform. And we will see what happens, but of course France would be a particular challenge perhaps to do radical reform, but that might be on its way. It's a very interesting time, and I think that if we have determined politicians that feel that they are encouraged by knowing that we can and will get re-elected if we actually do the right thing, if we do reform, then there will be more reforms. And I hope that I can contribute in some way to that actually happening.
Johnny Munkhammar, thank you. The book, The Guide to Reform, published by Timbro in association with the Institute for Economic Affairs, is in a bookstore near you.